Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Cigars and Literature. Today I have my great guest with me, Dario, my close friend and a soon-to-be father of a beautiful young boy. Now, today we're going to be discussing fatherhood within the framework of My Antonia and Washington Square. While we do this, we're going to be smoking cigars, drinking some beer, and having a great conversation. And hopefully we can enlighten the audience as to how father work properly works and how you can avoid certain things, how you can perfect certain things, and how you can truly take care of a child insofar as being a masculine figure and many other things. I have a good list of questions, and this is going to be just a casual conversation, and we're really trying to stab deep to the heart of fatherhood. So with that being said, Dario, have you read these books before? How familiar are you with literature? Just do a 15-second introduction. Tell us.
Well, 15 seconds, I don't even remember the books were named. My Antonia, probably is in Spanish. And Washington Square, Henry James.
Yeah, I think that's a great point.
I don't. What is it? What is it about?
Washington Square by Henry James. My Antonia by Willa Cather. So I think that's a great question. What is it about? Washington Square is a typical love story with a couple twists here and there, but it's about a woman who chooses to love someone despite her father saying, no, do not love this man. It's not right for you. And in doing that, you might think, well, of course, okay, the father just wants what's best, right? The father kind of does things wrong. He doesn't approach it the right way, right? He says don't love her, but it seems almost as if he doesn't love her in the right way. Now, I'm not here to critique him totally, but I am here to say that we can learn something from him. So it's a love story, and we'll get a little bit more into that. But when we go over to My Antonia, it's a story of the Great Plains, right? The American frontier, in a sense.
That's it.
A woman, friends with a man, this young man who doesn't have parents, but he has grandparents, who act as paternal figures in the absence of his true parents. And they're very different from Washington Square. They're very different from the single father in Washington Square because they show a type of love and care that it's forthright in how it comes at him, right? They want him to do the best he can do. They want him to be a lawyer. They want him to go out and discover and do these great things, but it's still lacking something, right? Okay. So I think right now is a great point to pause because I've lightly introduced the text before we fully dive in and say, Dario, regarding fatherhood, how do we go about it? You're about to be a dad in how many months?
In about 5 months.
5 months he's about to be a father. Isn't the biggest worry, how do I be a good dad?
Honestly, yes. I mean, and it's tough. I mean, obviously, looking up to seeing what it was, I feel like was really a key point, and seeing how I was going to be a dad. Obviously, or not obviously nowadays. You gotta really raise somebody, whoever they are, boy or girl, correctly, and it's just tough. It's tough. I feel like I'm not ready for it, but at the same time, I feel like I've always been ready for it.
That's beautiful. And I want the audience to notice that those last words, he feels like he's not ready for it, but at the same time, he feels like he's always been ready for it. And I think that's the beauty of fatherhood. And I think that's the way these books will play into this conversation and showing that you might not be ready for it, but by properly looking at the structure of fatherhood as depicted in works and literary arts such as these, you come to see, well, hold up, I might not be ready to be a father, but I can come to see what type of father I don't want to be and what type of father I want to avoid being. So first, I want to touch upon Washington Square by Henry James, and then I want to contrast it with My Antonia. Washington Square is about a father who says, you cannot love this man. You cannot love him, right? And in doing so, he comes off as cold and vicious and cruel. And albeit he has some issues, I don't think he's totally on the hook for a lot of things, but let's just disregard that for now. He doesn't approach love in the proper way. Now, he clearly says from the beginning, I do not want a daughter, I want a son. He wants a son, right? So when his daughter comes, he doesn't have a wife either. So we have two key issues right here that are fundamental to fatherhood. There's no mother in the home, single parent home. But then most importantly, he wanted a certain sex for the child. And upon getting the wrong one, everything's changed. So I want to ask you right now, how would you feel if you had a girl instead? Would this make you change the way you look at the child? And then my second question is, in a single parent home, can you even be a father? And I want to keep this within the realm of what I just told you about this, but I just want a brief, quick reflection on that so we can reflect it with the other
Really brief and quick. I mean, in a single parent home, you could still be a father, but especially if you're raising a young girl, you have to be a father. That's what you are at first, but you also have to be Yeah, I mean, as a guy, that's what I was scared of. You know, I don't know women's emotions. I don't know what they go through. Like, you know, the whole for like.
Yeah, there's a lot. There's a lot we don't understand.
So it's everything, you know, and I feel like a lot of daughters come out like their mothers, and especially in a home where you may not really know the mother too well.
Or you don't even have one.
Exactly, you may not know
There's
like,
a huge
how
issue
to
that
deal
arises.
with the issue there.
Okay, I think that's great. And regarding the other point, what about expecting the sex of the child, male or female, and being disappointed at one or the other? You being a father, you found out your child was a boy, of course.
Yeah.
God bless. Was there disappointment? Were you going to be like Dr. Sloper, the father of Catherine, and say, you know what, I'm disappointed and I don't know what I'm going to do anymore?
No, I definitely, I mean, as I'm not that guy, you know.
You're not that guy.
I'm not that guy. I'm not gonna lie, I'm not that guy. Because I was expecting a girl at first, you know. I was ready full on going for a girl. My wife, she was expecting a girl, you know. But it is what it is.
Yeah, that's great.
At the end of the day, I wanted a boy. Everybody wants a boy as like, you know, their first one, you know.
Yeah.
It's gonna be the older guy, like taking care of like, you know, his younger daughters, you know. God bless. I get some girls like later in life.
So I think,
but even then, I wasn't sad about it, but I wasn't also overly happy, you know, either or.
It was I'm having a child.
As
so
long as
regardless
they're healthy,
of the sex,
as long as
they're
healthy,
healthy, yeah.
whatever.
That's all. That's beautiful. And I think, folks, we've just established two main points. First off, the importance of the mother in the home, the importance of having a spouse, which Dr. Sloper suffers from. And if you read this great literary work, you're going to quickly see the importance of having a mother and what the absence in this work does. So I'd recommend that you read it. But then, secondly, what you touched upon most importantly was he's disappointed with his daughter because she's not a man. She wasn't a boy when she was born, right? Now, back at this time, they didn't have the whole transgender thing. So, you know, I don't think she's going to transition. I don't think he'd approve of that. But you touched on something real there. You got to the core of it, right? Being a father, it's not about necessarily saying, I want this, and if it doesn't happen, life's over. But it's saying, you know what, I want this. But if I get this, it's a blessing either way. I just want my child to be healthy. And it's okay to have preference. And I think that's beautiful that you recognize that. But I want to pivot, right? Because we recognize the toxicity of those viewpoints. We recognize the toxicity of, this is what I want, this is what I want. And not having a mother to be there to say, hold up, I think we need to do this too. And there's much more we could address in Washington Square, but we'll come back to that. I want to touch on my Antonia. Now, my Antonia, Jim, he's one of the main characters alongside Antonia. It's mainly told through his narrative. He's
so
often...
Jim's Antonia.
Huh?
Is Jim's Antonia?
No, Jim and Antonia.
Oh, okay.
So two different people, right? They're really close friends. If I could properly do justice to this story, which I probably won't, I'll admit it. Jim is this young boy growing up in the plains, growing up, you know, on a farm with his grandparents. And Antonia is a foreigner who's came to the country. They live close to each other, relatively close, right? So you see this dynamic of friendship. So in my Antonia, you see this coming of age for this young boy who doesn't have parents. He has grandparents, so he doesn't have paternal figures, right? They still push him to do what's right. They still push him to go out and work, take care of the farm, be respectful, be a young man who's not doing terrible things. So you see this child that have grown up in the urban environment, the farm, but he still grows up to be respectful. And his grandparents, even as you go along later in the book, you see him that they want to push him to be a lawyer. They want to push him to do great things in life. Now, it's not this super loving and super like, I love you so much. Like you see in some cultures, like the Cuban community or the Hispanic communities, where they're really, you know, it's like a lot of love up front, but it's more so this like gently pushing. This is what we want for you, just go do it. And I think right there we recognize, I mean, there's beauty to it, but at the same time, it brings up an interesting discussion. How much love as a father do you give to your child? And what type of love do you give to your child as a father? I think this is very important, you know, with a child on the way.
I feel like it's kind of tough as a father. You know, because as a father, you're the provider. You know, so maybe you're not there every hour of the day, but when you are there, it's the moments that count. You know, so I feel like the mother, it's kind of tough, like, you know, bringing me into this kind of story, because I feel like grandparents, either way, they might have not been there as lovingly, but they already been through that stage.
Yeah.
You know, they knew everything, like, you know, beforehand, and they were able to handle the caring of the child in a different aspect of it, and they did a good job of it, for what it sounds like.
Yeah. I think that's a great point.
I just want to clear that out.
I want to tie into this. I want to tie into this.
But,
because you brought up a great point, and it seems like fathers are the protectors and the providers. They're going to be away from the home a little bit. You see this, not necessarily so much in modern America, although it still happens. But you see the role with feminism, and you see the role with women going into the workplace much more often. So you don't see men as much. There's a little bit duality to it. But this brings up a great question of fatherhood. What does presence or absence do? And when we look at these two books, we have a father who he works as a doctor. So he's, so there's no mother. She's not there. That's completely absent. But then he's half present. Then you go to this, and the grandparents are semi-present. They're there, but are they really there?
You know what I feel like this really ties to? It's the good old, grade school nature versus nurture. I feel like it could just be, at the end of the day, nature is going to take its course, right? Whether you believe that or not, nature will take its course. But nurture also really plays a role in the upbringing of anybody. You either way, like you could wake up tomorrow and something major tragic event could happen and would change the whole course of your life from that point. I just felt like major, like.
I think the nature versus nurture is a fantastic point. I want to pivot a little bit because I think that's a great answer. And I want to say, when we look at these books, I know you're not completely familiar with it, right? We see fatherhood limited, right? And in that limited ability of being a father, right? Maybe you're too protective. Maybe you're too cold because you wanted a son. Or maybe your grandparents. And the typical theme with grandparents, there seems to be a disconnect between grandparents and children.
Okay. Yeah.
Right? You see that?
Yeah, like, everybody.
They're maybe a little bit out of the loop. They don't know what's going on with everything. Maybe they're not as in touch because there's a generational gap.
Of course.
So I think it brings up a great question. And when you look at fatherhood or the grandparents as fathers, you see a limitation. Now, is that limitation a failure? Or is that just natural to being a father? Is there always going to be a limit there? How do we go about recognizing this to prepare fathers to be ready?
It's tough, though. You may be ready, but at the end of the day, I don't know about you. I've always, wanted to raise my kid in the same eyes that I looked at my father, just because I did have a key role with my father. And I know that he didn't, but he was still a great father. So that's like, it's complicated because, he didn't have a father in his house. Like, when in his upbringing, he was still a great father in my eyes.
So it seems as what you're saying is limitation or failure on a father's part necessarily doesn't always imply that it's going to pass down. Yeah. The child still might turn out successfully. And in these books, I will say, we might apply that thought and say that Mr. Dario's right in my telling you, because by the end of it, we see Jim. Some people think that he should have had a relationship with Antonia. Some people thought that he always wanted to but never did. But point being, by the end of the story, he's almost like this godfather figure to Antonia and her kids. And at the last page of the book, he's seen meeting with her kids, right? And he's saying, I'm going to go hiking with you. We're going to go into the mountains together. And they looked up to him. So you see the sense in which, if you make the claim that his grandparents failed him or there was limitations or whatever it may be, you still see him to be there's something there, right? It's almost natural to who he is as a man, because by the end of the book, he's taking this father figure role, right, with her children. So I think that's beautiful what you said. And regarding children, yes, I think we can both agree. You're having a child. I want 16 children, right? I say the more the merrier.
Of course. I mean,
in a couple of years, who knows? He might have a couple more on the way. God bless. But I want to transition again, because he brought up a really good point regarding your father not having a father, and I want to tie it back to this book. Are fathers the moral guide for their children? Do they instill the way to go about life? And if so, how can we get you ready to be that moral guide for your child?
It's not that maybe they're the key pillar, holding the structure. But they're definitely a strong element that could be the key pillar. At the end of the day, there's a whole lot of walls holding up a house. There's every room has four walls to it, and there's four corners. Maybe there's three if you're in a the type of room, whatever. You know what I'm trying to say. You know
get what you're saying, yeah.
Sorry, I'm not.
You're doing great.
Yeah. But you know what I mean? Like, it's not just about fatherhood. It's more just like about fundamental structure. You know, because there's a lot of single moms doing it out here that they have to do both roles, and they do it pretty well. You know, it may not be the best way possible, but they do it.
Yeah, I think that's a good answer, and I think it will help tie us into the next question. But before we move to the next question, I want to bring up a good point. That moral guidance, you see Dr. Sloper in Washington Square, the father of Catherine, try to instill it in her in a weird way, try to implement his worldview on her. And even though some people would say he's a failure of a father, or he's not a great father, whatever it may be, it seems as if she still does okay for herself. Although the argument can be made by the end of the book, she's exactly like her father. But she seems to do okay. And then in My Antonia, although the grandparents are a little bit removed. Now, I'm not one for spoiling books, especially endings, because I know one day you might pick this up and read it. But as long as I have your permission to spoil it in such a way that you'll be motivated to want to read it later in life, potentially, do I have your permission to go ahead and spoil it?
Yeah, it's like watching the trailer to a movie. You know, like sometimes you go to watch a movie and you don't know what's going on. Kind of like I'm going with this book. But, you know, after the trailer, I might read the book.
You heard that, folks? We're converting him to Henry James and Willa Catherine. So, the ending of Washington Square, you see a woman who previously got rejected by the lover she chose. A lot of reasons for that, but let's just put that aside. He left her. Respectfully, unrespectfully, that's a debate. And then he comes back later. She rejects him and says no, and she chooses to be alone in solidarity. Never marries. Cut out from her father's will. Her father says, nope, you're not in my will any longer. You're not going to give me money from me. My Antonia, Jim goes on to become a lawyer. I believe he gets married, if I'm incorrect. Don't execute me. And then you see Antonia as a great mother. Right? So if we just focused on Antonia there, and we bring in her parents, she did have both parents. Right? She had a stern father. Right? Then she had a mother who was very reserved and a little bit chaotic and crazy at times. And I think that says a lot. Right? Because when we look at these characters, when we look at Catherine, and when we look at Antonia and Jim, it makes you ask the question, how are these people grappling with the legacy that they're leaving behind, that their parents left behind? And how did they get inspired through fatherhood, through parenthood? And how can a father do the same? How can you make it so your child is able to be inspired to want to pursue a legacy? How can you make it so your child does not end up as a negative one-off, but a good individual, right? And these books show us that. These books show us where to twist it and turn it a little bit, almost like a dial, not too loud, not too quiet. So I think that's a great question I'd like to ask you, grappling with the legacy, right? You said you look up to your father. You said your father, you know, he didn't necessarily, but... So when we're looking up to fathers, how do we handle legacy?
I mean, when you bring up legacy, I feel like unknowingly, you might have brought like a key moment in my life. I'm the first like part of my bloodline in the United States.
Because you're from Cuba.
Yeah. So my dad's side, my mom has a lot of family over here. My dad really doesn't. You know. So I feel like that's also why I'm happy having a boy, because like that's where your name goes through. That's your legacy. Your last name is your legacy.
Yeah.
You know, that's back in the day. Didn't they used to call him like, if you were like Jefferson's son, you were like, like you were the son of Jefferson. Or
you got to pause. Some people might call you sexist right now and say, "Well, hold up."
All right. If you were Jefferson's daughter, I don't think that's the last name though. But
I get what you're saying. Though. I get what you're saying. There's a legacy to be left by being a son. But let's just say she is a daughter. How can she fulfill her father's legacy? How, if it was a daughter, how do you still go about being a good parent?
What legacy? Do you want to fulfill their legacy or create your own? You know, at that point, it's kind of tough to, you know, some people even force their legacy on their children.
Like, go be a doctor.
Yeah,
like,
everything that they weren't able to do, they'll push it on their children.
Yeah.
It's like that one mom that's super crazy at the cheerleader tryouts because she never made it, you know?
Yeah.
What legacy?
Yeah, and I think that ties directly into Washington Square and My Antonia, because in Washington Square we see Catherine, indirectly or indirectly, fulfill her father's legacy and end up directly like him. And maybe you're unfamiliar with this, you might be familiar. Sometimes as children, or sometimes in life, we run from what we know we're going to become. And in running, we run right back into it, or we become it, right? So sometimes we don't want to become something, but in not wanting to become it, we actually turn into it even more. And in this, Catherine doesn't want to be like her father, who's over-rational and logical and cold and secluded and distant. But in the end, she's by herself, rational, cold, secluded, and by herself, right?
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
And then here, in My Antonia, you see Antonia. Her parents have a lot of children. And what does she do? She carries on that legacy in a certain sense. Not insofar as in a bad way, but she goes and has a lot of children, right? And it's successful, and she lives with her parents, you know?
I would say that's a great way. I mean, just like you were saying, you would have 16 kids.
I'm going to have 16 kids, folks. Tune in.
May the 17th come, maybe, you know?
Never pushing
the more
it.
the merrier.
32?
32, why not? Double it and then some.
Double it and pass it to the next person.
Okay.
So I want to ask you, we've lightly touched on Washington Square and My Antonia. I by no means want to suggest that we've done justice to these works. If anything, it's been a bit sloppy. It's been a bit rushed. But you can only expect so much in a short video. But I want to ask you, upon touching on these books, do you get the notion that there's anything you might avoid for being a father? There might be something you want to...
You know what? There definitely is. Just off the Washington Square, maybe there is that legacy that I want to put onto my children, but you can't force it. You know, at the end of the day, nature's gonna take its course. You know, it's gonna tie them back into what they are in their roots.
And if your daughter comes to you and says, "Hey, I found a guy I love," if you might not approve of him, let's just say he's terrible, and you say, "Well, I don't like him," does that mean you're gonna not like your daughter or not treat her with love and care?
I'm gonna be there for when I'm right. You know, I hate to say it, but like, maybe I'm right, and I'm still gonna be there for her. You know, I'm not gonna tell her that I'm right at the end of the day. But like,
we
hey,
know he's right. You know
but,
he's a father.
Hey, it doesn't make me shun her for choosing her own will. Not like, you know, literally, because apparently
of course,
they
yeah.
let her out of the will. But,
yeah. You see, he's already learning. Gotta pick it up and read it.
Um,
So you learn something from Washington Square insofar as not necessarily pushing a legacy, not necessarily being so cold to your daughter, and not necessarily being so, I reject you because you're this. I want to move to My Antonia now, right? And I want to touch upon the tone of, you might do everything right, but you might be a little bit distant, right? And how does, you know, the grandparents are a little bit distant, right? And then the parents of Antonia, I'm talking about Jim, the grandparents. And then Antonia, her parents are a little wild. She turns out okay. She's a little wild one, but there's a little bit of distance and confusion. How do we address that as you being a father? How do we look at that?
I'll be honest with like just my interpretation of the book. So is the book written through Jim's perspective? Okay, so this is Jim's Antonia, and it pretty much just ties.
He's keen. You see that? You see what he just did? This bright mind right here. Go on. So I think it's really important now to close off with this last question. We've seen the distance created by Dr. Sloper and his daughter, Catherine, right? We've seen the errors he went wrong and how you can personally apply certain things correctly to fatherhood to avoid that. We've also seen the same with My Antonia. But I want to now touch upon distance, right? In being a father, sometimes the wrong choices can make you very distant from a daughter or a son. And in My Antonia, you see grandparents who don't necessarily do anything wrong, but there seems to be implied underneath the relationship that there's kind of distance. Not that there's not love, but there's a distance. So I want to ask you, and this is more of you know, you got to contemplate it a little bit. What role does distance in a relationship between a boy and a father, a daughter and a father play?
It's a tough question. I mean, just to even whatever aspect you approach it in, distance is always going to be there. You know, I feel like whether it's the resentment side, as you see in the Washington Square, maybe she felt some resentment from her father's forceful will, or the distance in maybe there wasn't that really that loving care from the grandparents, just because they were more building the structure instead of supporting it.
You as a
know what I
father
mean?
now, I think that's a great answer. I want to take note of that. How do you apply that to your own life? Soon to be a father, I think, ending this off on a positive note, how do we take what you just said, apply it to fatherhood, but then take everything else and wrap it up into being a better father? How can you take these two books, everything we discussed, and what you just said, and integrate it into being a better father?
I feel like mostly just being there, not just, obviously day to day, but just overall. I mean, we've all made mistakes, and we've all, maybe hid something from our parents, but like, then know that your child might be doing the same thing, and not be forceful on your own mistakes, because your child will make their own mistakes.
So it seems, correct me if I'm wrong, children are going to have enough problems of their own, and as a parent, you need to love them, and that could be a little tough sometimes, but it doesn't mean putting them in a concentration camp and forcing them to walk the walk. It means loving them. And sometimes love is tough, but loving them truly, all the way, regardless of the circumstance. And if we apply this to you, soon to be a father, it seems to be saying that you're ready to love your child. You're ready to be there for them. And you're ready to understand that they are a child. And as they grow up and develop, there's going to be things they go through. There's going to be things they hide from you. There's going to be...
Exactly. And, I mean, there was always a term that I grew up with, is like, I could tell you that stove's going to be hot, you're still going to touch it. I could warn you a million times, that's a hot stove, you're going to burn yourself. Until you burn yourself, you don't know that hot, how hot that stove is.
That is a beautiful phrase, and I'm going to be the first one to say I've touched the stove many times. I probably got the scar somewhere on my body because I haven't just touched it with my hand. But I want to end off here, and I want to say that I think we touched upon something successful. I think we've really gotten at the heart of something. Washington Square, in my telling you, has really shown us that being a father is not just merely being there. Being a father is not merely just imposing a will. Being a father is not merely just having a destiny for your child, fulfill this legacy. If what I'm hearing correctly from you and from our discussion and what we talked about, it seems that we came to a conclusion that these books really aid us in seeing what fatherhood is not, and how it can almost become distorted, how you can almost go down a path and go the wrong way. And it seems to me almost inherent to fatherhood is those mistakes. So I think there's a beauty in reading these, and I would suggest that you read these immediately. I know eventually you'll probably get around to it. You have a brilliant mind. But I think these books successfully, even if our attempt to describe it unsuccessfully, can show one what not to do with fatherhood, what to do with fatherhood, and how to be a loving person, or how to avoid being a non-loving person. So I think with that being said, I think it's a perfect time for us to conclude. So once again, I want to give a round of applause to my close friend Dario, soon to be father in how many months?
5.
5 months. Beautiful. God bless. And I want to end off by saying that you're going to be a great father. I think if these books showed us anything, it's that you're ready for fatherhood.
I'm sure I'm ready.
So, quick little cheers to end off. That's it, folks. So I want to ask you, when we're looking at these books about these different relationships between father and daughter, father and son, grandparents, whatever, what lessons do you take?
Me too. Of being there for a child can be there. You can either be there for them much more than you don't have to. If that makes sense.
So I think
Which is very important.
I don't want to cut you off, but I want to lay this out simply because I think we're going diluted. I think you have a good message, but I think we have to break it down more simple. And I think the first one you laid out was great. So I want to ask you this: if you just had to go lay out 5 things that you could do differently from these fathers, right? You said the first one is
Not fathers.
not necessarily bad, but not all the way. What 5 things could you take away from these books to do better?
Raise your child right. Show them from right to wrong. Be there as much as you can. show them that there's not much love out there besides what you're going to get at home. And 5, never steal. Because you never get nothing good out of that. You know?
I think that last one's an interesting thing. Never steal. And I think if we use it metaphorically instead of just merely physically, we arrive at a deep message. Never steal, never take what's not yours. And I think when we apply that to the framework of being a father, your daughter's peace is not yours to take. Your son's peace is not yours to take. Don't steal the life from them. Don't steal the joy from them just because you're a father. And I think that last one was very profound because I don't think he just meant it physically. Don't take a book from the table and run to your house and read it. Don't destroy what your child has inherently. You have a message, you have a gift that God has given you. Bestow it upon them and protect them and provide for them. And I absolutely love that you said don't steal, because I think as father figures, these 2 books can show us, don't steal. Don't steal the life from your kids, but rather give. Give them love, give them care, give them prudence. Give them an environment where they can be nurtured. And then let nature take its place, because you've sent out a beautiful young child into nature who's raised right, who you didn't take from unjust. So I think that's fantastic. I think your 5 rules are very good. And I think looking at this book, we can clearly see it. I think throughout all of this, we either see a negation of one of those rules, or we see it applied, right? Like at the end of My Antonia, when Jim is looking at the children, he doesn't steal. What he says instead is, I'm going to give back to you. Let's go to the mountains. I'll climb with you. You can bring your father too. He doesn't say, hey, go get me some eggs from inside. I'll see you in 10 years. He says, no, I'll be back. We'll go on a mountain hike. And so he gives, right? And he's there, right? And even in this sense, we're in Washington Square, we see what not to do. The dad's not there when he needs to be there. He doesn't show good from wrong. So I think those 5 examples are absolutely fantastic. So I want to thank my guest, Bruce. He came all the way from across the country to be able to have this talk. So with that being said, I want to give a round of applause to my buddy Bruce. And that's all, folks.